I'm Jim Collison, and this is Gallup's Called to Coach, recorded on January 26th, 2022. Called to Coach is a resource for those who want to help others discover and use their strengths. We have Gallup experts and independent strengths coaches share tactics, insights, and strategies to help coaches maximize the talent of individuals, teams, and organizations around the world. If you're listening live, love to have you join us in our chat room. There's a link right above us there on the live page. Click on that, sign into the chat room there on YouTube. Love to have your questions during the program. If you're listening after the fact, you can always send us an email with your questions. Send that to coaching@gallup.com. Don't forget to subscribe to Called to Coach on your favorite podcast app or right there on YouTube. Click the subscribe button and you'll never miss an episode. Saurav Atri is our host today. Saurav is the regional leadership coach and workplace consultant for Gallup out of our Singapore office. Saurav, I'm not going to lie. I'd like to be there with you today doing this live. I can't, but welcome back to another Called to Coach.
Thank you, Jim, and good morning, good evening, and good night, depending on which part of the world you're in, from sunny Singapore. And we also have Jim in the US, in Omaha, as well as Derrick from Australia. So we've got pretty much the whole world represented here from different time zones. And it's so good to be back on Call to Coach. And I've been really enjoying listening to these Call to Coaches over these years, Jim. There's so many amazing nuggets, and I hope you're watching as well. And I love hosting this as well. So let me get started introducing our special guest for today. I am privileged to introduce to you our guest, Derrick Leong, who's a managing director at Accenture Australia. And he's been with Accenture for over 15 years, leading high-performing teams to successfully deliver large-scale system change initiatives involving hundreds of people and thousands of man-hours. You can imagine, these technology initiatives takes a lot of time, but also a lot of contribution from people. And he's been working with his teams over so many years, creating human contribution. That's powerful. And he himself, and having known him for a couple of years now, he's a very people-focused leader. And that's why he even invested in his own development of becoming a Gallup-Certified Strengths coach. So all the coaches that are out there, he's part of the community as well. He's also a certified strengths coach. And he's been using strengths as a foundation to drive performance and retention with his direct reports and hundreds of people that are reporting to those direct reports as well there. And over the last years, especially during the pandemic, it's been let's be honest, it's been tough times for everyone out there. And Derrick has been navigating these worlds, these complexities we deal with, and has been experimenting with a few techniques to successfully scale the use of strengths within an organization, while also helping each individual in his organization achieve happiness and fulfillment. He's also very active on LinkedIn, just like me. So if you would like to follow his advice about technology or leadership or coaching and career guidance, you can follow him there as well. Derrick, we'd love to hear you talk about what you do at Accenture and your top 5 theme.
Thanks, Saurav. Hope you can hear me. That was a great introduction. But first, thank you, Jim and Saurav, and everyone listening for giving me the opportunity to share our story, and I hope you find it helpful. First off, I would like to state that the opinions expressed today are my own, and I don't speak for my company, Accenture. So with that out of the way, my top 5 themes are individualization, relator, learner, arranger, and responsibility. I apply my top 5 to most aspects of my life: family, people, and clients. I use individualization to appreciate and cater for what's unique about the people or situation. I use relator to get to know the people involved at an intimate level. I use learner to always apply a beginner's mind. And I use arranger to be flexible and efficient. Finally, I use responsibility to get the job done and meet my commitments. For all those of you out there listening that know me, the last one wouldn't be a surprise, as I'm also the eldest child in my family. So in a nutshell, I bring fresh perspectives and insights to people to help people achieve their goals.
And I know, Derrick, you've been very passionate about human engagement and strengths as well. Tell us about your why. What makes you passionate about this science of both strengths and engagement?
Oh, thanks, Saurav. Thanks for giving me an opportunity to share. I'm passionate about employee engagement because of 2 things. One, professionally, I've seen the significant competitive advantage an engaged workforce can provide, especially in terms of productivity, innovation, and retention. Personally, I live for the moment when I see someone else's eyes light up after a coaching session has made them realize their untapped potential.
And if you think about, being in that moment, being that manager to all these people, especially with the virtual world as well, and it's hard, no doubt about that, trying to engage people virtually, Derek. So what's your advice around how do you then, in this complex world, move the needle on engagement? And for your teams as well, Derek, I know there's been some, insights you'd like to share around how did you achieve that shift in both their emotional contributions and also their well-being at work. So what did you do? What's your advice for people who are listening in to do that?
Oh, thanks, Sarah. Well, I have to admit, I was quite nervous about speaking here. So I gave this some thought beforehand. And I would like to share my answer around three pieces of advice on how my team and I move the needle on engagement. So the three pieces of advice I like to share are: one, get leadership support; two, get data and context at the team level; and three, recognize that engagement is personal and intimate. Broad measures rarely work. So I'll start the story. It begins with getting leadership support, sort of. So for me, moving engagement in a large organization like Accenture is a team effort. And it's like changing course for a large cruise ship, or if you like, an aircraft carrier. It takes time, sustained intent, and the use of small course corrections. In my mind, such an endeavor is not possible without leadership support. Now, thinking back, this started several years ago when my boss, Ian Smith, and I were sitting in a small white walled meeting room, considering our latest task, which was to help turn around a struggling program. By all accounts, the team had the skills, experience, and commitment to get the job done. But they were operating as individuals, and mistakes were being made that could have been avoided if there was greater transparency and collaboration. I proposed we take a more people centric approach to turning the ship around, pun intended. And Ian was very supportive and gave me the agency and encouragement to do what was needed. I want to say that back then, the safer solution would have been to double down on productivity and quality metrics instead. So thank you, Ian, for having faith in our people and me. So with leadership support, I had access to Gallup strengths assessments and reports for all 70 plus people on the team, as well as the ability to launch Q12 engagement surveys as often as needed. With these powerful tools in hand and leadership support, within 1.5 years, Ian and I transformed this program to be one of the most successful programs in the portfolio and achieved a 94% increase in the quality of what we delivered. I could not have done this without leadership support. James, I was going to pause here and maybe and the audience as well, just to see what do you both and everybody else in the call think of the importance of getting leadership support in such initiatives.
Sorry, let me defer to you. I'll let you start.
I think, Derek, so critical to have that leadership buy-in. Without that, you can't move the needle for a larger initiative. I say leadership is about making decisions. And this is an important decision that influences lives of people. So absolutely, I fully concur that if you don't have that leadership buy-in, your impact can only be limited to the people that you influence. But if you get them on board first, the impact just magnifies to much larger audiences. Jim, your thoughts?
Yeah, when we think about those 5 steps of creating a strengths-based culture, the one of those very first steps is this idea of leadership buy-in, and it's a challenge though. I don't want to paint this as a picture of being this is the easy part to get leadership buy-in. Oftentimes we see in organizations it can rise up through the ranks from bottom up, if we use that analogy, top down, bottom up. It is really a challenge, and I think it's a question, Derek, that I get asked a lot is how did I get that? It sounded like you had Ian's buy-in from it. He saw that right away. What kind of advice would you give to individuals or coaches or folks that are working in organizations where maybe that leadership support is lacking to begin with? Would you have any advice on how could they get that started if they don't have it clear to begin with?
Oh, that's a great question, Jim. My advice would be to have the conversation. And again, it might be some of my relator and individualization coming through, but have the conversation with your leaders. And it might not be a light bulb moment straight away, but I think through multiple conversations, through sharing your own strengths, and even maybe convincing them one at a time to get the strengths assessment done and talking them through it, I feel that would make a difference, Jim.
Yeah, I love what you just said. I think sometimes we're afraid to ask, and you just have to take the risk and have the conversation. So that's great. Yeah, Derrick, back to you.
Oh, thanks, Jim.
So Derrick, then first advice, go ahead. Derrick, first advice was getting leadership buy-in. What's your second advice?
Oh yeah, thanks, Sarah. Good lead-in. My second advice is getting data and context at the team level. So the saga continues, part 2 of our story. So thinking back again, we used to have broad engagement surveys that go out to large programs made up of hundreds of people. We would get a respectable participation rate, maybe 50 to 60% of people surveyed, and then we'll get results that are averaged across this broad group. And then we'll use these broad results and agree on actions for engagement and try to address them. What we found was that we had some initial good gains in engagement, but it quickly plateaued and we struggled to make an impact or increase participation going forward. So with that context, just thinking back again, so after our success with turning that program around, I found myself in a local cafe with a cup of cappuccino in my hand, having a chat with my boss's boss, David Hoskin. David has always been a strong people advocate, and he shared that the situation with the broad engagement surveys and generated actions has been on his mind. So, hearing about what we had achieved by focusing on people, he challenged me to replicate the same success, but this time with the wider portfolio of programs, made up of roughly 480 people at that time. Now, my first thoughts were, what have I gotten myself into? And this is on top of my day job. It definitely didn't help that when I shared this with my boss, Ian, his first reaction was to laugh and say, "Don't mess it up, Derrick." Next, I got together with our HR lead at that time, Sonia Lynch, and we got stuck into it. By chance, we came across a case study describing Google's Project Oxygen. For those that are not familiar, Project Oxygen was a multi-year study by Google to answer the question if managers still mattered, especially in our age of agility and flat hierarchies. I took away 2 things for Project Oxygen. Managers still mattered, and they play a significant role in an employee's organizational experience. The next thing I took away was create a cool name for your project to get others to rally behind. So, inspired by Project Oxygen, Sonia and I created Project Courage, hoping to inspire our people to have the courage to ask and give honest feedback. Project Courage used Gallup's Q12 survey to get engagement data at the local team level. And when I say team, I mean an average of about 8 to 10 people per team. We wanted data that was specific to that person's experience at their local team level. Project Courage then used Gallup-Strengths as a common language to have meaningful conversations regarding those results. We ended up with 97 participation across hundreds of people with results relevant to their experience among one of 60 teams. We finally had the data at that granular level relevant to an individual's local team experience. That was lesson 2. I'll pause here. Jim, sort of keen to hear your thoughts and the people on the chat as well. what do you think is the
And Derrick,
importance of understanding an individual's local team experience?
And Derrick, I have a question for you building on that. The average participation rate on engagement surveys is normally 82%. How did you get to 97%, which means people wanting to share their opinions? What are your thoughts on that? What was the big, insight for you in creating that 97% participation rate?
Oh, that's a great question, Saurabh. And I don't want to tease a bit of the part three of the story, but I think getting to the participation rate was just making it real, in my head at least, to the team members. So, when you think of broad generic surveys, sometimes you don't know where it's going or how you're going to answer it. Like, are you answering at an organizational level or are you answering at your team day-to-day level, right? So by doing it this way, where we say, okay, I want to know what is your experience day to day? How are you experiencing your world in your team? I think that makes a big difference, because then we could have team leaders talking to individuals and just telling them how it mattered and how it will matter. So that is how we got the engagement.
Beautiful. Jim, any questions from the audience or for you?
Not yet. I'll just to remind those listening live, if you have your questions, put them in chat. I'll bring them in as we go. But Derrick, I've got a question around, sometimes we talked about skeptics of leaders being skeptical, maybe, and you have to get leadership buy-in. The opposite is true when, especially in engagement surveys, where you might have individual members of the team that are a little skeptical that you're actually going to do something with this data that you're giving them. And they may be even vocal about it to the team around them. You hate to say a bad apple spoils the whole barrel, but it can, right? In the sense of a team dynamic. How did you approaching getting that high of an engagement rate? You had to do a few things to encourage them to participate in it. Did you have any pushback? How did you handle it? Or how did you prep them so that maybe it minimized that pushback?
Oh, that's a great question, Jim. I think the one thing that I've learned is communication. So I think leading up to it, we had to communicate it. And then once the service was launched as well, we had sort of 1 or 2 weeks of sort of focus from the leaders, from the managers to their team to say, this is something that's important to us as a team leader, but also as an organization. And we really want to hear your opinion. And yes, Jim, you're 100% correct. We cannot stop the skeptics. But I think actions speak louder than words. So I would say the skeptics, I think we've got to accept and empathize, but then we got to just continue to do what we're doing, and then hopefully they'll come around.
Yeah, in that group of 100, there were 3, right? If you had a 97% rate, there were 3. They're real people in that, and it makes it difficult. Sarav, I think, can attest to this as well. I think sometimes when we approach engagement surveys, we think the point is the survey itself. And while that's important, the preparation we do, the communication, Derrick, you just said, the communication that is done prior, the team support from the managers, how the managers are going to be supported on this is very, very important. So the pre-work is almost as important as the survey itself. Would you give any tips to somebody going into this as we think about maybe some of the pre-work that you guys did? What did you find particularly helpful through that process that you might share with somebody else?
Oh, I think the best, maybe the one piece of advice there, Jim, from my perspective is I heard something and I've always sort of lived by it since is communication. When you communicate something, communicate it 7 times. So now I'm getting used to sort of hearing myself like a broken record. But what I realize is that not people for good reason might be distracted, or they could only be there for a short period of time, and so just issuing one piece of communication and in one channel, you might think it's enough and everybody should listen and know where you're heading, but it's not always the case. So I would say just put yourself out there, and even if you find yourself repeating yourself, I think it's important to get the message out clearly. Yeah.
Sorry, Derrick, didn't mean to interrupt you on that one. Catherine asked a question, I think, along these lines. She says, what types of communication did you utilize to prepare for Project Courage? By the way, love that name. As well as the time leading up to it. Did you find yourselves using multiple channels then to get that communication done?
Oh yes, yeah, it's a good question. Thanks for the question, Catherine. Yeah, we use multiple channels. Obviously, email is a channel, and we had teams, so we had team channels. that were for the wider team. So we posted announcements on Teams, even messages. We leading up to it was probably, and I think to answer that question, was probably a month or so. And so we had probably twice weekly communications, via email, via Teams. And what we do as well, we have town halls. So again, utilizing those town halls, making sure everybody's aware of what we're trying to achieve, when it's coming out, when it's closing, what's the importance of it. So really just almost like, and to be honest, we even went as far as lean coffees, team meetings. So every channel we were just using it and repeating the message, and I think that's definitely helped.
Holly makes a great statement. She says you got to be the chief reminding officer at times, right? Too. That's a great way. Steve, one more question before we move on. Steve asked, the 97% participation rate, it was great. What feedback did you receive? And maybe don't give away what part 3 is if this entitles it, but what feedback did you receive from all levels after the Q12 survey and results? And I'll say, was any of it surprising to you afterwards? So you got that 97%. Was there any feedback that you got that was interesting?
Oh yeah, I think if I look at and I believe it was Steve, Jim, in terms of the feedback, and I'm not talking about the feedback of the actual survey, but just people just coming up to to us and say, I think one of the key things that stuck with me, a lot of leads came back to say, well, I always thought my team was great. I thought my team wasn't the team that had issues. And suddenly it's just staring them right in the face, because again, this is at the team level. This is really in a sense, their team members telling them what they needed. And that was real eye-opener for a lot of the managers and team leads, where they always felt it was some other team, right? My team is great. And so I think, in terms of feedback, it's probably one of the key feedback that we received that was impactful.
Derrick, with 97%, did you guys celebrate that in some way? Was there some kind of
we did
some kind of moment? Because that's fantastic. Like, I think that's another important aspect of this. When you do get there needs to be some kind of celebration to say, great job. I mean, yeah, we're going to celebrate the data when it comes out, but to get 97% is pretty great. Saurav, I'll throw it back to you for part 3.
Thank you, Jim. And Derrick, it's interesting you shared that capture the context. In Gallup, we say measure to manage something, and that's the power of data. Is it gives you real insights, and you're not just locked into one perspective. So I'm curious to hear part 3. What happened after you got that 97%, feedback, and what did you do about it, and what's your third advice?
Thanks, Saurav. So for everybody, we have arrived at part 3, the final piece of the puzzle, the finale. Or is it? Well, stay tuned to find out. So, recognizing that engagement is personal and intimate, and that broad measures rarely work. So, for all of those of you paying attention, I still had my work cut out for me, since David challenged me to move the needle on engagement, not just participation. So, despite having the data with context, despite our best efforts and intentions, we didn't seem to be reaching our people on the ground. And worse, our middle managers and team leads seem to be the most disengaged. So by all accounts, our message was getting lost in translation. So what do we do next? We reached out. With help from Gallup, we decided to reframe the problem away from solving engagement for everybody. Instead, we refocused people on having meaningful impact on those colleagues closest to them, direct reports, immediate bosses, and peers. We ended up using a framework that forms the abbreviation SELF, S-E-L-F. S for self-discovery through strengths coaching, E for empathy, understanding the strengths of your peers and team, L for language, having the common language of strengths, and F for feedback, measure and recalibrate, using the Q12 and one-on-one conversations. We worked with Saurav and executed SELF over 2021, providing one-to-one strengths coaching for all 40 plus managers and team coaching where they worked in the same unit. Where did we land? We ended up exceeding expectations by a factor of 4. Again, achieving that high participation rate. This time about 98%. So we managed to convince that one person there, Jim, in our surveys, and we increased engagement scores for these managers by an average of 0.7 across these 8 teams. And finally, increasing retention and productivity also across this management group. We managed to make engagement personal and intimate. James, Saurabh, what do you think about how we got here and what we achieved?
Well, Derrick, let me first say that I love that acronym you've come up with self-discovery, empathy, language, and feedback. I think it sticks so well. And I could see as I reflect back on those experiences, I think everybody in the organization, and I felt it, that you were genuinely interested to help them at a deeper level. So I loved how you created that narrative to go deep, to understand their problem. Because let's be honest, a survey is capturing people's opinions, but also you're capturing their expectation. And after giving a survey opinion, a person has an expectation something will be done about it. Because if you don't, then it'll be destroying that engagement because the expectation get raised the moment you ask somebody a question. What I love is you went deep. You went and said, let's take this initiative to the ground and make people's lives, well, change, help them evolve. So I loved how you sort of narrated that in that self acronym. Jim, any thoughts from you? And I see a couple of questions also coming from the audiences as well.
Yeah, Catherine was asking, did you also take the Engagement Champions program? Sorry, maybe you can talk a little bit to that with Gallup to be able to deliver the state of the team results from the Q12. And maybe you can talk about the actual delivery, because I think for some folks, the delivery of the reports is a big mystery. Like, so what do you do the day these reports come out? So Derrick, maybe you can talk a little bit about that. Sarv, you can add to that as well.
Oh, no worries, Jim. Yeah, and thanks again for the question, Catherine. So when the results came up from Project Courage, what we ended up doing was actually holding the team leads and those managers accountable for having those conversations with the team. So when the results came out, the way we're structured at Accenture is that it's full transparency. So once the results are closed, everybody gets a picture of the results. So I found that really initially I was a bit nervous when that happened, but on hindsight and post the conversations, that was fantastic because kind of everybody sort of was on board. There was no hiding it. We just had to have the conversation. So we ended up having those managers having dedicated sessions with their team to talk through those results and agree on next steps.
And as you Jim mentioned about the strengths or the engagement champions program. So essentially what we've discovered at Gallup is also, engagement is an inside out initiative, which means people need to act on those opinions. Somebody needs to get together with the team and talk about this. What does that really mean for all of us? And that's where, even at Gallup, we believe in empowering people within organizations, helping them understand what these 12 elements of engagement is and how do you make sense of it. You get a report, so what should I do next with? How do I practically go back and have a meaningful conversation with my team to move the needle? Because I see a lot of challenges, Jim, in this one, where managers get that report and they typically achieve responsibilities of the top 10 strengths of the world. They said, this is my job to fix it. So they jump in and says, okay, I see this problem, I'm going to fix this for you. But in reality, engagement is when you involve people, because imagine, right, if I'm going to a meeting room and I'm asking people's problems, okay, I'll do this, you're also raising expectation for them. How do people feel? Oh, it's my manager's job to fix this. So they're putting the monkey on their backs, right? So I felt and I saw that with Derrick's team, it was not just him leading the way, but it was more of involvement and contribution. So people were involved in running these activities. The managers were very much engaged in all the conversations we were having. Those team conversations we had, even around strengths, they had their buy-in. And that's, I think, from my perspective, those 2 advice Derrick has given, or 3 advice Derrick has given so far, getting that leadership buy-in. The second thing I saw that he captured the data to then get the influence to the remaining team members also. Because people think, yeah, I'm great at doing this job. I'm a perfect manager until the data hits them. That's when the needle shift in their brain. I need to do something differently. That's when they get involved in it that, hey, I care about my people, but clearly something is not landing. Let's do something different. I think that's where the shift started happening in their brains. And I always believe in that before a behavior shift can happen, an emotional shift needs to happen. The buy-in needs to happen. data, in my perspective, created that buy-in. And of course, Derrick's leadership and conviction that we need to do this made the needle move. So just on that, Jim, I know a couple of people are quite curious about how did that shift the perspectives of people. So, Derrick, I would love to hear your thoughts on how did the managers respond in terms of taking that ownership and moving the needle for their teams as well, because that's what leadership is about, helping them make the move, right?
That's a great question, sort of, and I think I like to preface just to say that we're still on this journey. So we started having a conversation with the managers and getting the feedback on how they had, what was the response from their team when they created those action plans, and where to next. Did that work? What results were they seeing? As we get more and more, as we redo these surveys over and over again. So I think that's kind of where it was, sort of where, it's in terms of the managers, they were saying yes. Initially, it was an eye opener, and when they had the conversations, though, some of them were saying they were struggling to get the actions to be taken. And it's to your point, sort of, I think coming from personally as well, high responsibility. When I had the initial meeting, I freely admit that I took on all the actions. And I'll apologize to my team right now because what happened was, day-to-day things just came into play, and I ended up maybe doing one or two of them, but not following through on the rest. And again, it's a learning experience for me, and hearing from the managers, it ended up to be, and those leads, a lot of them had the same experience. And now we're trying to say, okay, similar to what you're saying, sort of, let's do it again, because again, we have data now, we have the participation. Let's not just stop. Let's learn. And so what we're doing now is saying, okay, don't just take everything, resist the urge. Don't take everything on to yourself, and try to get your team members involved. Get the actions, get them involved in the actions itself. Hold them accountable, but don't be responsible for the actual actions.
And there are a couple of people here want to know what your self model was, what it stands for. Could you just sort of summarize for us those 3 pieces of advice, as well as those self module for others to just sort of reconfirm that?
Oh yeah, happy to. So self, again, just repeating, it's a SELF, S for self-discovery. So focusing on discovering, yourself through strengths coaching. E for empathy, showing empathy, understanding the strengths of your peers and team members. L, focusing on using strengths as the common language. And finally, F, probably the most important one, feedback, right? Measure, recalibrate, learn from future Q-Job surveys, and continuous one-on-one conversations.
And Derrick, having been on this journey and still continuing on this journey, what's been your biggest insight that you'd like to share with the audiences listening in?
Oh, thanks, Saraf. I'll say my biggest insight is summed up by quoting Winston Churchill. Perfection is the enemy of progress. So behind the story that I just shared, there were many failures and experiments from which we learned and persevered. I could honestly say that if I had waited to plan out the perfect journey in detail before proposing it to either David or Ian, nothing would have happened. In fact, even when putting this story together to share today, a quote from Steve Jobs about connecting the dots came to my mind. I believe he said, "You can't connect the dots looking forward. You can only connect them looking backwards. So you have to trust that the dots will somehow connect in your future." I couldn't have summed this lesson up better than he did. Through this, I have learned to be more comfortable with vulnerability and failure.
Wow, what a beautiful quote there. And thank you for sharing that story with us, Derrick. And now, what's next in store for your teams going forward? How would you sustain this momentum? Because you've sort of explored part of success there where people are involved. What's next coming for you?
Oh, thanks, sir. Well, as I said, this isn't the end of our story, as we intend to continue our journey. And we plan to work with our managers now and replicate the success of self into their teams, right? Promoting SELF, self-discovery, empathy, language, and feedback. Now, maybe we can share that story in the future. If Jim, you and Saurav will have us back sometime in the future. So everybody in the audience, hit that like button to let Saurav and Jim know how you feel.
Beautiful. Thank you for sharing that, Derrick. And as you think about some of the barriers, well, people listening in says this sounds great. You can see the big needle shift on engagement has happened there. What barriers can they sort of learn from your experiences that they need to do differently or watch out for? So what would you say?
Yeah, that's a good question. So in terms of barriers, I would say, thinking about the three pieces of advice, getting leadership support, I would say, yeah, getting that leadership support, getting those advocates and allies is critically important. So I do empathize with what Jim is saying, that not everybody's as fortunate as me to have that, that leadership, support from the get-go. So I'll say that that's one of the key barriers. And I think, again, as we talked about, just having that conversation, being, being vulnerable and putting your idea out there and sort of working on it is critically important. And then next, as you said, again, going back to the second lesson is getting the data. So getting the data at the right level, right? So that's a barrier, because if you're not solving the actual problem, then no matter what you're doing, broad engagements, multiple engagements, you'll find that it doesn't translate down to the person on the ground. So that's a barrier. You need the data at the right level, right? And finally, again, third piece of advice: engagement is personal, intimate. So, just relying on broad measures, all-encompassing initiatives, I think they are going to move a little bit. But again, what you're going to see is that that result plateauing very quickly.
And Steve has a great question here, Derrick, around what is something you might do differently or better the next time you have to run this initiative?
Oh, that's a good one, Steve. I would say it's taken a while, right? So it's again, it's a long. It wasn't an overnight success. So if I was going to do it again, and I'll take my own advice, let's just say, because again, I learned a lot, and me and my team, we learned a lot. We had failures, and we persevered. We tried again. So if I was going to do it again, I'll take my own advice. I will, to sort of accelerate the journey to get where we are here, because again, this isn't the end. We still have to work on sort of getting to the ground level and keeping this sustainable and consistent.
Beautiful.
Derrick, one of the things I like to do when I was managing our interns and our intern programs was to kind of onboard with Q12. In other words, spend some time in their onboarding process talking about why these questions are important, not necessarily asking them the questions, but we did. I mean, in a way of getting the data back, but teaching them about what it meant to know what's expected of me, or to know that I'm getting the opportunity to do what I do best every day. As you guys are now looking, you've gone through this experience once. Any thoughts to the formalization of some training around these Q12 concepts in between the gaps? Conversations are great and you got the data and you're making some progress, but any thoughts on additional kind of using that framework for continued learning and maybe even pulse surveys here in the future on how some of those things are going?
No, that's a great question, Jim, and you probably touched on one of the more recent insights that we've seen is sort of training or empowering our leads to better understand how do you hit those key needs from the team. Especially the first couple of fundamental questions, which is what is expected of you. How can how can you bring out the best in your people? So there's definitely something top of our mind right now to say, okay, now we've engaged those managers and we want to roll this out. We want to scale this, but I can't scale it. I'm just one person. And if you look at Dave and Ian as well, they're just one person. The only way we believe we can scale this is to your point, Jim, training our managers, getting them to understand the importance, getting them to understand how do you address those fundamental needs of their followers.
And on this same concept, Derrick, people listening in says, "Hey, I'm a leader, I'm a manager, and I've got my hands full doing all this work." So, what does a day in the life of Derrick looks like? How much time do you devote to engagement, and what do you do to do that? And of course, you got your full day job as well. You said this is on top. What does that look like? Would love to hear your thoughts on that.
Oh, now you're putting me on the spot, sort of. So I'll say my day, and most people are laughing. For those that know me, would be just packed with meetings. And so I'm sort of, even myself, I'm learning to, how do I prioritize what is important. So if I think people are important, and obviously just client work is important, how do I find that balance? So not putting one over the other, and just making sure that I make the time. So one of the key things I do every day actually is spending the first 10 to 15 minutes just sorting out my calendar for the day, and making sure that how much of my day am I prioritizing to work versus to people. And if one or the other is too low, then I have a serious think about how do I rebalance that. And actually, I'll throw in, because one more thing is the I would say the third priority that I try to balance every day is my own time. So my own well-being, because not looking, I feel that more and more leaders need to look after ourselves. So how do we prioritize some focus time for myself, just to understand, reassess, and just improve going forward? So really three aspects, which is people, work, and me.
That's great. That's great balance, by the way, just as we think about this. Steve had asked a question earlier too. Sometimes in strengths engagements, we utilize strengths champions, right? We find those informal individuals in an organization that naturally lend themselves towards strengths. They're cheerleaders for it, advocates. They talk about it positively. Did you see engagement champions come out of this where individuals just kind of naturally gravitated towards the system and began to become advocates, even though maybe it wasn't their role or their job to do that? Derrick, any thoughts on that?
Oh, thanks, Steve. Thanks, Steve. No, I think, look, I want to emphasize again, this is not a solo effort. So when I sort of allude to team, we actually had a team of champions to sort of go off and make sure that those 60 teams. I have no way I could coordinate the creation of 60 teams. Again, 8 to 10 people within those teams. We had key engagement champions across the portfolio that helped, that we work together to create and engage, communicate across those different programs. So I would say, yeah, engagement champions are definitely needed, and getting them to sort of buy in and drive some of these key outcomes is fundamental to getting to where we get to now.
Love it. Catherine, one more question, maybe, unless I put a final last call out to the chat room. But how often, as you think about the future of this, what's best case scenario for the next iteration? Because the first one's great. The second one is even better, because now you've got a baseline to compare it to, right? I mean, if you're a data nerd, you're just begging for the second one. You're like, can we take it tomorrow? So what are you guys anticipating from a frequency, Derrick?
No, that's a great question, Jim. Catherine. Again, we're learning. This is something we're learning. So initially when we did it, the first with Project Courage, we had to do it annually, because I would have to admit that it took us a while to sort of get the information back, assess all the data coming from 60 teams, and just understand where to next and how do you facilitate the follow-ons, and then set up everything again to launch the Q12. Because I say, the teams change, people move around, so that there's always that administrative overhead. So initially, it's we're definitely looking at annually, just because of the work around it, pre and post, to your points as well, Jim. But I think going forward, once we've gotten a bit more familiar, and I say we, I mean myself, the engagement champions, the leaders, everybody on the ground, you're getting familiar with what a Q12 means, how to respond, and less of that administrative pre-work needs to be done. Still important, but less. We are looking to sort of get to a point where we're hopefully launching it quarterly. So it's almost like pulse checks. I think maybe that's what you were suggesting, Jim, for the leaders themselves to understand how their team is going. Are there any small course corrections that we could do along the way?
Yeah, well, you can really begin to see progress that way too. You want to be careful. No good deed goes unpunished sometimes. And so you do this. And then, of course, you guys mentioned this earlier. Oftentimes the leaders take responsibility for it, and it's not always their fault. right? In fact, in most of the cases, it's not their fault. And so, but leaders get very defensive. And so I think there's that support. You mentioned this earlier. There's support to leadership to say, like, hey, okay, we're getting this data back. This is our problem. Like, or these are our problems, or even better, these are our successes. Like, these are the things we're doing. I think that's something we miss sometimes in engagement, is celebrating those successes that we're having and saying, you know what, we're getting, the expectation question is number one. It's the most important question. If you're getting that right, I mean, sometimes that's half the battle in an organization, of just people understanding why they got hired. I don't know why that's such a problem, but it is. And so, good for you guys as we think about some of that frequency that works. Sarv, do you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, I think, Jim, a couple of things, so this is where I speak with a lot of leaders. Then, like you said, they take the score personally. This is my problem. This is a reflection on my management style. So I always tell leaders to depersonalize the score, but personalize the engagement. Because as we know, 70% of factors that affect employees' engagement is within the span of control of the manager. So yes, this is not a reflection on your management capabilities, but yes, it is a reflection on the team's environment, and you have the biggest control, so you can do something about this. And to this point also, having that outsider's view and that eagle's eye view to this whole journey Derrick was taking this organization on. And my biggest takeaways from that, just watching him, observing him, and seeing that, can be, I think, from my perspective, summarized into 5 C's. The first C for me would be clarity. I think I've spent enough time with leaders. What I found with Derrick was that he had this conviction and clarity of what he wants to do, which is to really change the lives of people working with him, help them be better, both from an engagement perspective and well-being. So that for me was, clarity is very important. Why are you doing this? What are you going to do about this? And who needs to be involved? So that's why he said, let's get the leadership on board. And he was really committed from the forefront. The moment he went through our Gallup-Certified Strengths coaching course, we've had been connecting regularly, where he's been talking about, hey, how do I do this? How do I do that? And we've been really brainstorming that together. So for me, clarity is important. Second thing is, you need champions in an organization to move the needle. And Derrick being the greatest champion and the first champion himself, moving the needle, but he got others on board, the leaders, his team members, the managers. So having those champions are very important to create momentum around any initiative. You can't, as he said, move the needle by yourself. It's a team effort, but you need to gather the team, and then you need to be the person doing the rally cry to get those champions on board. And then third was coaches, especially in the virtual world. Derrick and I, he being a certified coach as well, we split the people that you're going to coach this person, I'm going to coach this person. So we gave each person an opportunity to vent. And I felt that was very important in a virtual world where you're by yourself in your house, feeling lonely, you have nobody to vent out to. That was an outlet for people. And we heard a lot of frustrations as well. Let's be honest, people are feeling the pressure from the external world also. And it builds up, at work as well. So I think that listening, venting, and also the opportunity to ideate I felt very helpful. And it was a great relationship builder for Derrick as well. When you're a coach manager, you get an opportunity to build a human connection with somebody as well, because they share their frustration, their challenges, and you're helping them sort them out themselves. The fourth C for me was contribution. I think what Derrick's leadership was about, bringing people on board so they want to contribute. So I've never seen conviction, like I've seen from Derrick's team members who had coached as well. They were volunteering their time to record their testimonials when we reached out to them. Hey, could you share your feedback? And he said, yeah, I love to. I think this is great. And they were calling Derrick's contributions and Ian's contribution and Dave's contribution in making this initiative successful. So for me, it's also about generating contribution from the team members. And finally, capture insights, success stories to create momentum for the next steps. So we actually got David Hoskins on video sharing his experiences of going to strengths. Ian talked about this as well, of course, Derrick and his team members. So that created this whole momentum around, hey, success begets success. So when you capture those positive stories of impact, it generates that motivation for others to also join the bandwagon. So having said that, while Derrick is very humble and he says, one person can't make a difference, but I felt through his clarity and conviction, he did, because he paid attention to the right things. So thank you, Derrick, for this. And Jim, any other question, thoughts, and anything that you'd like to add on?
I think we're good from the chat room. Derrick, I'll say from my side, thanks for coming on and being vulnerable. This is not easy to do, and it's always great to have you share. We'll be excited. So the answer is yes. We want to have you back next. We want to have you back when we get another set of results from you, or whenever you want to share something with us. Be great to hear. I think everybody kind of loves to see it. We talk, Sarv and I talk about this stuff all the time, and it seems very theory-ish, right? Because it just does. But when we have a customer on who's like, yeah, we did this and this is how it worked out, that's pretty powerful. Derrick, do you want to add anything else? Any final thoughts from you before I close this thing up?
No, thanks. Thanks for the opportunity again, Saurabh, Jim, and for everybody who's listening, for letting us share our story. And it's been a pleasure sort of working with you, Saurabh. Yeah, definitely.
Pleasure's mine. And to all the people listening from Asia, Gong Si Fa Shoi, which means Happy Chinese New Year, and a Lunar New Year, which is coming up in a couple of days' time, and to you as well, Derrick.
And happy Chinese New Year to you as well. I figured this year I needed an extra break, so I'm taking it. I'm just gonna celebrate it along with everybody else. Not really. We've got a learning series coming up, and so I'll be working during it. But to everyone celebrating that, a happy New Year to you as well. Sarv, any final thoughts then before we wrap it?
Well, here's what I'd say is, you have the opportunity to invest in people. And we've got tons of courses coming up as well, whether it's around, for your organization, you can invest in creating engagement champion. That's one. I love to teach it. I feel so energized by it as well. But also the Gallup Global Strengths Coaching course. I'm a huge fan of that course and I love teaching it. And of course, partnering with coaches like Derrick, who's been through those journeys there. So, go online, check out on Gallup's website, all the opportunities you have in different time zones in Asia. We've got one happening in February. India time zone, Singapore time zone, and Australia time zone as well. So join in the journey. We'd love to have you on board, and let's invest in human nature, human beings. I think this is the greatest gift we have, is to create a difference in people's lives. Because when you're 70 years old, you look back, nobody would remember what targets you've hit, but people remember how you've changed their life. So let's make a difference. Why not, right? Jim.
Very, very well said. With that, we'll remind everyone to take full advantage of all the resources we do have available now in Gallup Access. Head out to gallup.com/CliftonStrengths. You can log in that way. Lots of great information for you there. For coaching, master coaching, like Sarv was mentioning, or if you want to become a Gallup Certified Strengths Coach, you can always send us an email. Even with the Engagement Champions course, send us an email if you have questions. coaching@gallup.com. That address is good for just about any questions that you have. coaching@gallup.com. And we'll get someone to get right back to you with that info. You can join us on any social platform just by searching Clifton Strengths. And if you're listening to this as a podcaster there on YouTube, click that subscribe button. It's right over here, so that you never miss an episode. I don't ask a lot, but click that like button as well. It just kind of helps us with discovery in the networks, in the social networks, or here on YouTube when we're doing it. Thanks for joining us tonight, and thanks for coming out. With that, we'll say goodbye, everybody.